guilty to murdering two Maryland sisters who vanished more than 40 years ago. Sheila and Katherine Lyon were 12 and 10 years old when they disappeared from a shopping mall in 1975. The mystery rattled the region and sent fear through the community. Lloyd Lee Welch.
Imagine keeping the same phone number for 42 years, not because you forgot to change it, not because you didn't think about it, but because somewhere out there, your children might try to call home, and you needed to make sure that when they did, you'd pick up. That was John and Mary Lyon's life for 4 decades. Same house, same number, same door their 2 little girls walked out of on a warm Tuesday morning in the spring of 1975, and never walked back through. They sat through press conferences that led nowhere. They chased down leads that evaporated into nothing. They watched investigators work the case, then set it down, then pick it back up again years later. They watched the entire world move on around them while they stood completely still, frozen at a moment that the rest of the neighborhood had long since stopped thinking about. But John and Mary never stopped thinking about it. They never stopped waiting. And after 42 years, 4 decades of silence, of dead ends, of waking up every single morning with the same question burning in their chest, the call finally came. The answers they had spent their entire lives demanding were delivered not to an empty house, not to a grieving widow, but to a mother and a father who were still standing, still in that same house, still by that same phone. That is the kind of love this story is about. But it's also a story about something darker, something that crept into a quiet Maryland suburb on what should have been just another spring afternoon. Something that shattered the illusion of safety that an entire community had taken for granted and never quite got back. This is the story of Sheila and Katherine Lyon, 2 sisters, one ordinary Tuesday, and one of the longest, most agonizing searches for the truth that this country has ever seen. Before we get into it, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. I love knowing where this community is tuning in from. Some of you are watching from places that genuinely surprise me every single time. And while you're down there, hit that subscribe button if you're new here. Every single week, we sit with cases like this one, stories that deserve to be told, families that deserve to be remembered, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Stay with me, because what happened to these 2 little girls, and what their parents did for the next 42 years, is something you are not going to forget. March 25th, 1975 started the way the best days do, quietly, gently, without any warning of what it was about to become. The winter had been long and gray the way Maryland winters always are, and this particular Tuesday carried something different in the air. A softness, a warmth that hadn't been there the week before. The kind of morning that makes you feel like the world has exhaled. Spring break had just started, and for kids all across Kensington, Maryland, that meant one thing: freedom. Kensington in 1975 was the kind of place that still believed in itself. A tight-knit, middle-class suburb just outside Washington, D.C., where neighbors knew each other's names and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. The kind of community where you left your front door unlocked and thought nothing of it. Where safety wasn't a policy. It was just the air everyone breathed. The Lyon family was woven into the fabric of that community. John Lyon was a familiar face, but more than that, he was a familiar voice. He worked as a radio personality at Malal, one of the most listened-to stations in the D.C. area, and for a lot of families in the region, his voice was part of their morning routine. He was warm, steady, the kind of man who made you feel like everything was going to be fine just by the way he spoke. At home, he and his wife Mary had built something real: 4 children, a house full of noise and love, and the beautiful, ordinary chaos of a family in full motion. Their oldest, Jay, then Sheila, then Katherine, and the youngest, Joe. Sheila Lyon was 12 years old on that Tuesday morning. In 5 days, she would turn 13. She was on the edge of something, that electric, uncertain threshold between childhood and whatever came next. People who knew her described her as bright, a little more serious than her sister, the kind of kid who paid attention, who noticed things. She wore gold-rimmed glasses that gave her a certain thoughtful look, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that made her seem older than she was. Her little sister Katherine, Katie, to the people who loved her, was 10. Where Sheila was serious, Katie was light. She was the free spirit, the one who laughed first and asked questions later. She had bright blue eyes that people remembered long after they'd met her, and a small birthmark on her thigh. But what people remember most about Katie wasn't any one feature. It was the energy she brought into a room. She made everything feel a little warmer. Together, Sheila and Katie were inseparable, the way only sisters can be. They moved through the world as a unit, sharing a private language built from years of inside jokes and whispered secrets, and the particular shorthand that develops between two people who know each other completely. They were each other's constant, their own little world inside the bigger one. On the morning of March 25th, that little world had a plan. With school out for Easter break, the girls wanted to walk over to Wheaton Plaza, a popular shopping mall about half a mile from their house. Half a mile. In that neighborhood, in that era, that was nothing. That was a casual stroll through familiar streets on a beautiful spring morning. The mall was the center of suburban life back then. Brightly lit, full of shops and chatter, and the particular energy of a place where everyone gathered. For the spring break crowd, it was especially alive. Easter exhibits, window displays, the smell of food from the food court. For Sheila and Katie, the draw was specific. The Orange Bowl, a pizza spot inside the mall that was a popular hangout for the local kids. A slice of pizza and an afternoon of wandering. That was the plan. Simple, safe, completely ordinary. Before they left, around 11 o'clock in the morning, their mother Mary gathered them at the door. She reminded them of the family rule. Be home by 4 o'clock. No later. She pressed $4 into their hands, just enough to cover lunch, and she watched them go. That moment, the door closing, the sound of their footsteps on the walk, the sunlight catching them as they headed down the street, that moment was so unremarkable that Mary probably didn't even pause on it. Mothers send their children out the door 1,000 times. There is no ceremony to it. No wait. It's just, goodbye. Be safe, be back by 4. She had no way of knowing she would spend the rest of her life replaying it. Sheila and Katherine Lyon walked out into the sunshine that Tuesday morning, and they never came home. The walk to Wheaton Plaza was short, and the girls made it there without incident. Inside, the mall was doing what malls do on spring break, buzzing with kids and families, full of noise and color and life. Sheila and Katie moved through it the way they always did, together, comfortable, at home in a place they'd been dozens of times before. They met up with friends and made their way to the Orange Bowl. Their older brother Jay spotted them there, eating pizza, laughing, just being kids on a day off from school. He didn't think anything of it. Why would he? They were fine. They were exactly where they said they'd be. He moved on, and that moment, his glimpse of his sisters over a slice of pizza, became one of the last confirmed sightings of Sheila and Katherine Lyon alive. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sisters were seen leaving the mall, and then something shifted. A witness came forward later and told police about a moment they had seen that afternoon inside the mall. A man, a stranger. He had been talking to the girls, engaging them in conversation, holding what appeared to be a tape recorder. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't obviously threatening. He was just there, talking to them, and the girls were talking back. This man, who would become known in the investigation simply as the tape recorder man, was the kind of detail that makes your stomach drop when you hear it. Not because it's loud or dramatic, but because it's subtle. Because it's exactly the kind of thing that doesn't register as danger until it stacks. Too late. A man with a recorder, asking questions, being friendly, to two girls raised in a community that trusted itself. That might have seemed like nothing. Maybe he worked for a radio station, maybe he was doing a survey, maybe he was just some guy. He wasn't just some guy. That detail, the tape recorder, the conversation, the moment that lasted long enough for a witness to notice and remember, would become one of the most significant and most frustrating clues in the entire investigation. Detectives would chase it for years. They would interview hundreds of people, follow dozens of leads, and come up empty every single time. But that was still to come. Back at the Lyon house, the afternoon moved on the way afternoons do. Mary went about her day, the hours passed, and then 4 o'clock came and went, and the front door didn't open. At first, it was just a flicker, a small, nagging feeling. Her daughters knew the rules. They were good girls, responsible girls. Being late wasn't like them. Mary picked up the phone and started calling. Their friends, the people they'd mentioned seeing at the mall, anyone who might know where they were. But no one had seen them since they left. The sun started to sink, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and with every passing hour, that small flicker of worry became something larger and darker and much harder to name. It moved through Mary the way dread moves, slowly, then all at once. By 7 o'clock, it was no longer worry. It was panic. The raw, cold, body-level panic of a mother who knows in her bones that something is wrong. She called the Montgomery County Police. And the moment investigators began looking into it, really looking, they understood almost immediately that this wasn't a situation that could be explained away. These were not kids who ran away. These were not kids who were prone to disappearing. Sheila and Katherine Lyon were exactly where they always were, right up until they weren't. And that distinction matters. It mattered then, and it matters now. It told investigators from the very first hours that whatever had happened to these two girls was not something they had chosen. As darkness fell over Kensington, the search began, and it was massive. Helicopters cut through the night sky with searchlights sweeping back and forth across the neighborhoods and woodlands between the mall and the Lyon home. K-9 units moved through the trees in long, careful lines. Divers went into the local ponds and streams. Hundreds of community volunteers fanned out across the area, calling the girls' names into the dark, refusing to go home until they found something. John Lyon, the man whose voice had been a comfort to DC listeners for years, went to his radio station and used that voice for the most desperate broadcast of his career. He went on air, and he begged. He pleaded for anyone who had seen his daughters to come forward. He described them: Sheila with her gold-rimmed glasses, Katie with her bright blue eyes. His voice, the one that always sounded so steady, cracked in places that no amount of professionalism could smooth over. Posters went up everywhere, on telephone poles, in shop windows, on community bulletin boards, the smiling faces of two sisters staring out from every surface in the neighborhood, asking the same silent question: "Have you seen us?" The answer that came back was silence. Days passed, then weeks. The frantic, urgent energy of the initial search slowly, painfully gave way to something harder to carry: the grinding, relentless work of an investigation that wasn't producing answers. Detectives interviewed thousands of people. They investigated sex offenders across 3 states. They chased the tape recorder man lead in every direction it would go. They followed up on every tip that came in, and tips came in by the hundreds. Because the community wanted so badly to help, wanted so badly for there to be an answer hiding somewhere in the noise. There wasn't. Every lead dissolved. Every tip went cold. Every direction the investigation moved eventually hit a wall, and detectives would turn around and start again from the beginning. The case, enormous and sprawling and heartbreaking, slowly began to freeze. If this is your first time on this channel, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Because this is what we do here. We sit with the cases that refuse to let go. The stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. For the Lyon family, the weeks becoming months becoming years was not an abstraction. It was lived. It was felt in the body, every single day. John and Mary made a decision early on that spoke to a particular kind of love and a particular kind of refusal. They would not move from their home. They would not change their phone number. They would stay exactly where they were, exactly as they were, so that if their daughters ever found a way to reach them, there would be no obstacle, no wrong number, no disconnected line standing between them and home. Think about what that means. Think about what it takes to make that choice, and then honor it for 4 decades. They became fixtures at press conferences, appearing year after year, with a grief that never softened and never faded. Their faces aged. Their hair turned gray. But the look in their eyes when they spoke about Sheila and Katie never changed. It was the same look on day 1 as it was on day 10,000. Not just grief, something beyond grief. A fierce, unwavering refusal to stop demanding an answer. They threw themselves into advocacy, supporting other families of missing children, showing up for people who were just entering the nightmare they had been living for years. In the world of missing persons cases, John and Mary Lyon became symbols of endurance, of love, of the specific agony of not knowing. Other families looked at them and found something to hold on to. If they can keep going, we can keep going. But the public's strength had a private cost that most people never saw. Because behind every press conference, behind every appearance, behind every statement John or Mary ever made to a camera, there was a house with 2 empty bedrooms. There were birthdays that came and went, with no one to celebrate. There were Easters, the very holiday that had sent the girls to that mall in the first place, that arrived each year like a wound being reopened. How do you grieve someone when you don't know what happened? How do you hold a funeral when there's no one to bury? How do you find any kind of peace when the last image you have is a front door closing and sunlight and the sound of your daughter's voices saying goodbye? You don't. You just keep going. And that is exactly what John and Mary Lyon did. They kept going. For 10 years. For 20 years. For 30 years. New detectives would occasionally pick up the file and take a fresh look. But the trail was frozen solid. Witnesses' memories had faded. Physical evidence didn't exist. Every avenue that had ever looked promising had already been exhausted by someone before. The case sat in the files of the Montgomery County Police Department like an open wound that refused to close. Unresolved, unforgotten, and seemingly unsolvable, until 2013. In 2013, a new team of cold case detectives made a decision that would change everything. They pulled the Lyon sisters case out of the files and decided to treat it as if the girls had disappeared yesterday, not as a 38-year-old mystery with a frozen trail and faded memories, but as a fresh, active investigation. They started from the very beginning. They went through tens of thousands of pages of documents, every interview, every witness statement, every lead that had ever been followed, every dead end that had ever been hit. They read everything, they questioned everything, and they looked for the thing that every cold case team hopes to find, the detail that was always there but never fully seen. They found it. Buried deep in the original files was a statement from a young man who had been briefly interviewed in the days following the girl's disappearance. His name was Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. In 1975, he was 18 years old, a carnival worker who had been at Wheaton Plaza the day the sisters vanished. He had been interviewed as a witness, one of hundreds, and he had told investigators that he'd seen the girls and watched them get into a car with another man. His statement was taken, noted, and filed away with thousands of others. The new team looked at Lloyd Welch and saw something the original investigators had not fully pursued. When they dug into his background, the picture that emerged was deeply disturbing. Welch wasn't just a young guy who happened to be at the mall that day. He was a drifter. A man who moved from town to town, following the carnival circuit, never staying anywhere long enough to be known. And more importantly, he was a convicted sex offender with a documented history of crimes against young girls across multiple states. This was not a witness. This was a predator, and he had been in the exact right place at the exact right time. Then the detectives found something else. From 1975, buried in the archive, there was a police sketch, a composite drawing of a man who had been seen inside the mall that day, staring at Sheila and Katherine with an intensity that made a witness uncomfortable enough to report it. Investigators took that sketch and placed it next to a mugshot of Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. from the same era. The resemblance was chilling. The pockmarked skin, the sharp, intense gaze, the particular shape of the face. It wasn't a perfect match. Sketches never are. But it was close enough to stop the room. Close enough to make investigators look at each other and understand that this name, this face, this man had been sitting in their files for nearly 40 years. And there was one more piece. In their research, detectives discovered that in 1975, Lloyd Welch's family owned land in Bedford County, Virginia, a remote, rural, mountainous area about 200 miles south of Wheaton Plaza. 200 miles. Far enough that no one had ever thought to look there. Far enough that if a man wanted to take two girls somewhere, no one would find them. This was exactly the kind of place he would choose. A theory began to take shape. Quiet at first, then louder as more details emerged. What if Sheila and Katherine had never been in Maryland after the moment they disappeared from that mall? What if they had been taken south, driven hours away to a place completely removed from the search, from the helicopters, from the volunteers, from the K-9 units, while an entire region was combing the wrong geography? Don't go anywhere, because what comes next is the part that took 42 years to uncover, and it is the piece of this story that will stay with you long after this video ends. In February of 2014, Montgomery County investigators publicly named Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. as a person of interest in the disappearance of Sheila and Katherine Lyon. By this point, Welch was already incarcerated. He was serving time in Delaware for a separate sexual assault conviction, and detectives made the trip to sit across from him in an interrogation room for the first time. When they walked in, Welch looked up at them, and before they could say a single word, he spoke first. "I know why you're here. You're here about those two missing kids. Let that land for a moment. Not, what's this about? Not, I don't know what you mean." He knew. He had always known. And somewhere in that knowing, The wall that had protected him for 40 years was finally, slowly, beginning to come apart. Over the following months, investigators conducted a series of interrogations with Welch that were as maddening as they were revealing. He was not a man who confessed cleanly. He lied constantly. He shifted his story. He minimized his own involvement. He pointed fingers at other people, family members, acquaintances, and then walked those stories back and replaced them with new ones. He was slippery, calculating, and clearly experienced at saying just enough without saying too much. But through all of it, through every lie and every contradiction and every attempt to redirect blame, one thing kept emerging. He placed himself at the center of what had happened to those girls. Every story he told, however distorted, however self-serving, kept coming back to the same truth. He was there, and he wasn't just a bystander. The picture that prosecutors eventually pieced together from Welch's fragmented statements and the testimony of witnesses and family members was one of calculated, predatory evil. Lloyd Welch had not stumbled across Sheila and Katherine Lyon by accident. He had targeted them. He had watched them in that mall, watched them with the kind of focused, predatory attention that the witness had noticed and reported and that had ended up in that sketch, and he had made a decision. He lured the girls away from the mall, using what means exactly? Whether it was the tape recorder, whether it was some other ruse, whether it was something else entirely, remains part of the uncertainty that has always surrounded this case. But he got them into a vehicle. And he drove south, 200 miles south, to the remote wooded family property in Bedford County, Virginia, where no one was looking and no one would hear anything. What happened to Sheila and Katherine Lyon in Bedford County is something that no script can fully convey and no words can adequately carry. Prosecutors believe the girls were held, assaulted, and ultimately murdered, killed to ensure they could never identify their captor or tell anyone what had been done to them. Welch's own accounts of those events were fractured and inconsistent, shaped always by his desire to minimize his role. But the core of what happened was never seriously in dispute. Two little girls who had left home for an afternoon of pizza and Easter exhibits never made it back. In his confessions, Welch told investigators what he said happened to their bodies. He claimed he was directed to get rid of them, that he placed their remains into two large duffel bags, carried them to a remote location on Taylor's Mountain, and burned them in a large fire. This part of his account was partially corroborated by something investigators found when they went back and re-examined the records from 1975. Multiple witnesses from that time and that area recalled seeing a large fire on the mountain around the relevant period. A fire that burned for a long time. A fire that, according to those witnesses, gave off a smell that was strange and deeply wrong in a way that had stayed with them for decades. When investigators descended on Taylor's Mountain and the surrounding Welch family property, they brought forensic teams and equipment and the full weight of modern investigative technology. They dug, they sifted, they searched the earth for anything that might be left, any trace, however small, that could confirm what had happened and give the Lyon family something to hold on to. The earth gave them nothing. After 40 years, whatever had been on that mountain was gone. The fire, if it had burned the way Welch described, had done its work completely. There were no remains to recover, no physical evidence to anchor the case to that location beyond the accounts of witnesses and the words of a man who had spent his entire life lying. This is the hardest part of the Lyon sisters case to sit with, and there is no shortage of hard parts. Because what it means is that for John and Mary Lyon, justice would come without the one thing every parent in that position deserves. They would never have their daughters back. They would never have remains to bury. They would never have a grave to visit, a place to go and sit and speak to the girls they had spent 42 years looking for. But prosecutors pressed forward. Because they had something else. They had Welch's own words, inconsistent, shifting, blame deflecting, but always, always placing him at the center of the crime. They had witnesses who could now testify to having seen Welch at the mall that day, watching the Lyon sisters with a focus that had made them uncomfortable, and crucially, they had members of Welch's own family, relatives who had lived for decades with the weight of what they suspected or knew, who finally, after all these years, were willing to talk. In July of 2015, a grand jury in Bedford County, Virginia, returned an indictment. Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Sheila and Katherine Lyon. The predator, who had hidden behind a carnival worker's anonymity, behind the geography of a state line, behind 40 years of silence, was finally going to be held accountable. The final chapter of the Lyon sisters' case did not come with a dramatic trial. There was no courtroom battle, no parade of witnesses, no closing arguments that laid out the full horror of what had happened in front of a jury. Instead, it came quietly, with the particular, bittersweet stillness of a moment that has been waiting a very long time to arrive. On September 12, 2017, Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. stood in a Bedford County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree felony murder. He still denied, even in that moment, that he had personally harmed the girls. He still tried to position himself as a lesser participant, a man who was present and complicit, but not the one who crossed the final line. But under Virginia law, his role in the kidnapping made him legally culpable for what followed. His hands, in the eyes of the court, were not clean. They had never been clean. In exchange for the guilty plea, which spared the Lyon family the trauma of sitting through a trial in which graphic details of their daughter's deaths would have been presented and dissected, Welch was sentenced to 48 years in prison. Combined with his existing sentence in Delaware, it was, for all practical purposes, a life sentence. Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. would die behind bars. The courtroom that day was filled with law enforcement officers, detectives, investigators, officers from multiple agencies, many of whom had spent years or decades working pieces of this case. People who had sat with those files in the small hours of the morning, who had driven to Bedford County and stood on that mountain, who had sat across from Lloyd Welch in interrogation rooms and listened to him lie. They were there. They had all stayed in it long enough to see this day. And then there were John and Mary Lyon. After 42 years of waiting, they were in that room. Both of them, still standing, still together, having outlasted every dead end and every silence and every morning when the answer hadn't come. They had made it to this moment, the moment they had anchored their entire lives around, the moment they had refused to leave their house and change their phone number for, the moment they had attended press conference after press conference in hope of for 4 full decades. They had made it. When it was over, John Lyon walked outside and stood before the cameras one last time. The voice that had once filled living rooms across the D.C. area, the voice that had gone on air in the desperate first days of 1975 and begged for information about his daughters, that voice spoke again. And it was different now. Not broken, not triumphant, something quieter than either of those things. He said, "We just want to say, simply, thank you. It's been a long, long time. And we're tired, and we just want to go home. That's it." That was the statement. Not a declaration of victory. Not a cry of justice served. Just, thank you. We're tired. We want to go home. The exhale of 2 people who had held their breath for 42 years and were finally, at last, allowed to let it go. Mary Lyon passed away in 2024. John Lyon died in 2025, at the age of 85. He spent his final years knowing the name of the man who took his daughters. He had heard the confession, fractured and self-serving as it was. He had sat in that courtroom and watched the guilty plea entered. He had lived long enough to see Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. sentenced to die in prison. He never knew where Sheila and Katherine were laid to rest. He never had remains to bury. There was no grave, no marker, no physical place on this earth where he could go and be close to his girls. But he had the truth. And after 42 years, the truth was everything. This case leaves behind more than grief. It leaves behind a lesson, hard and permanent, and written into the collective memory of an entire region. Kensington, Maryland in 1975 was a community that believed in its own safety. It was a place where a mother could send her daughters to the mall half a mile away and feel completely certain they would walk back through the door by 4 o'clock. That certainty ended on March 25, 1975, and it never fully returned. Parents held their children a little closer after that day. The world felt a little less like the place they thought it was. The Lyon sisters' case also changed the way people thought about cold case investigations. It proved that 40 years is not too long. It proved that buried files contain answers worth digging for, that witnesses who stayed silent out of fear can eventually find their voices, and that the truth, however deep it's been buried, however long it's been waiting, has a way of surfacing when the right people refuse to stop looking. The detectives who reopened this case in 2013 deserve to be named in the same breath as the Lyon family. They chose to treat a 38-year-old disappearance as if it had happened yesterday. They read every page. They followed every thread. They sat across from a lifelong predator in a prison interrogation room, and they stayed in that room, visit after visit, until enough of the truth came out to build a case. That is not routine. That is not just doing a job. That is a particular kind of commitment that this family and these two little girls deserved. Sheila Lyon was 12 years old, 5 days away from her 13th birthday. Bright, serious, thoughtful, on the edge of becoming something extraordinary. Katherine Lyon was 10. A free spirit with bright blue eyes and a warmth that people remembered for the rest of their lives. They walked out of their house on a beautiful spring morning with $4 between them and a plan to eat pizza and look at Easter exhibits. They were inseparable in life, and in the end, they were taken together. They deserved more than 42 years of silence. They deserved more than a fire on a mountain and a confession that came 4 decades too late. They deserved to come home. But what they have now, what this case has given them, finally, incompletely, irreversibly, is the truth. Their story is known. Their names are spoken. And the man who took them from their family, from their future, from that sunny Tuesday morning in 1975, is exactly where he belongs. If this story moved you, if Sheila and Katherine's story is one you think more people should know, share this video. Put it somewhere someone else will find it. These girls have been remembered by their family for 42 years. Let them be remembered by a few more people today. And if you've never subscribed to this channel, now is the time. Every week we come back to stories like this one. Cases that refuse to be forgotten. Families that refuse to give up. Truths that took far too long to arrive. I don't want you to miss what's coming next. Sheila and Katherine Lyon, gone on March 25, 1975. Never forgotten. Rest now, girls. Your parents kept the phone. They kept the door. They kept the faith. And in the end, the truth found its way home.